First of all, thank you, Sir Craig. Thank you, Tristram, for the huge privilege of chairing a wonderful roundtable session looking at blue and green crime, both completely new topics to me. So I was able to bring what I hope was a fresh eye and perhaps a new and enthusiastic perspective. But let me give you the summary from our panel. I think just in terms of overall takeaways, and again, forgive the fresh-eyed reader here, but what struck me was the blue and green crime spaces are clearly highly attractive areas for criminals to move into, offering, as they do, new commodities to trade in, new ways of making money. But also, they are attractive areas for licit traders to move across into. They're sufficiently adjacent to what people are already doing in many cases to make it quite easy to make the move from legal to illegal and increase your profit while doing so. In addition, I think I was struck by the interlinkages between the crimes and the perpetrators in these areas, and perhaps the lack of understanding amongst global law enforcement and even academic communities of those interlinkages, which I think would clearly repay further study. Huge point here made by all of our expert panelists. The complex variety of social factors and demand that are driving these crimes, which again seem generally poorly understood, and the huge complexity of the law enforcement challenge, the need for specialist knowledge from specialist agencies that in many cases don't have long histories of working together, no trusted or human relationships on which to build, and so very much a greenfield site when it comes to attempting to undermine these crimes. And as previous panels have clearly concluded, all aided by a distinct absence of data in many cases, or where we do have data, patchy data or the wrong data. So I must say I came up with a rather tortuous analogy for this piece. I felt as if we were all looking into a nighttime Olympic stadium with a packed agenda of track and field events, but the floodlights are out and all we've got is a couple of torches. And occasionally we illuminate an event with no real understanding of what's actually going on, who's playing, what teams are involved, or what the rules are. In some cases, perhaps we've got a little bit of a clearer idea, and I'll highlight some of those later. But overall, we're still looking for the switch for the floodlights and the overall manual of rules for these new crime areas. So delving then away from my my ingenue observations into the detail, we had the scene set for us over the 2 days by 6 really excellent presentations from 5 superb speakers and illuminated by snapshots from another 6 presenters. And I hope I will do all of them justice. They certainly did us proud in their contributions. So we started with Tim Edmonds, who gave us a masterclass on current understanding of and responses to transnational organized crime at sea. He noted this included piracy and smuggling, environmental crimes such as illegal fishing. He drew our attention to a growing international concern and the cross-boundary nature of these crimes, inevitable, of course, land and sea boundaries, national boundaries, agency boundaries, and the challenge they pose to national constructs and regional constructs, and the linkages that we're seeing between different criminal activities and networks. He gave a great summary of our knowledge of maritime crime, the data quality and gaps, cooperation and coordination between law enforcement agencies, and the balance between policing crime at sea and the need to address root causes and consequences across the land-sea divide. And again, he gave us some great vignettes on cooperation and coordination between maritime law enforcement agencies across the regions. We moved on then to another superb presentation from Kancheli Adrisu, who gave us a case study on mapping the illicit e-waste trade between the UK and Ghana. Her views were that this trade was profit-driven, poverty a key underlying factor, noting a short lifespan to the crime and a non-hierarchical structure amongst those perpetrating it. Her conclusions were that better communication to people in Ghana in local languages, both about the role of serious and organized crime, about health and environmental issues, and about the clear linkage between e-waste and environmental crimes, enabling people to see the connections, while also critically not looking as if we're victim blaming. It's not necessarily Ghana's fault that its people are engaging in the e-waste trade, and just looking as if it is their fault is no way to go about tackling this transnational issue. We then heard from Chris Alden, who used the sharp rise in illegal ivory trading in Tanzania to conduct a focused study of Chinese transnational crime organizations and their role in this trade. He showed us how the research insights are now allowing us to understand the structure of these Chinese organizations, their MO, the networks and association along the global value chain, and their supply chain within Tanzania and onward to the consumer market in China. We then heard from Matt Norman, who considered the relationship between blue and green crimes, how they relate to other crimes such as corruption and money laundering, how international law enforcement organizations in maritime and environmental field can and should cooperate. And he drew our attention to some excellent examples from Indonesia, showing how through community engagement, one can develop a different understanding of blue and green crime and gain valuable insights into the form of the response that would be most effective in undermining those crimes. And then finally, from amongst our panelists, we heard from Jacob Phelps, who discussed his research into the legal opportunities in different countries available to bring lawsuits under environmental liability legislation. He noted that there could be a framework to facilitate the development of future cases focused on remedies for harm to biodiversity and test case litigation. He argued for a whole systems approach to tackling serious and organized crime in this space, as well as understanding and communicating, again, the diverse impact that serious organized crime has on socio-cultural and economic structure. He asked about the potential for liability litigation to be more broadly and strategically applied to environmental crimes, and how these processes might be supported, typically in the global south. So having heard from those presenters who brilliantly framed the topics for our discussion, we moved into the detailed roundtable work. And it was very clear, I think, from the roundtable, as well as from the presentations, that we do have some data in some areas. Piracy, in particular, is not bereft of data, and thanks to the good work highlighted by Chris and others, we now understand a whole lot more about these end-to-end supply chains and the different interventions that can be taken at different points along their journey. However, we didn't allow ourselves to be too optimistic. The agility of the criminals in terms of their move between focus and geography, the paucity of qualitative data in particular, undermining our ability to understand root causes and underlying social issues, and again, corruption, not just facilitating the crime, but debilitating our access to the data we need to prevent that crime. And again, a number of times, I think ports were highlighted as being both a source of data and a source of the corruption that is stopping us get to that data. And I think they would definitely repay some further research. Looking at the undermining side, as we were exhorted to on the second day, again, the roundtable identified areas where the response could be effective in the maritime domain. Again, speakers highlighted that there were hotspots and regional areas where the response had been effective and gave us good case studies, but typically the response is too fragmented. It's hampered, particularly in the environmental and wildlife crime space, by a different understanding of the nature of the crime and inconsistent responses. Again, this lack of coordination and trust between specialist agencies, the fact that different elements of the supply chain are typically addressed in different ways, and therefore the effectiveness of the whole is undermined. This was due to, in our speakers' views, different appreciations of the problem, the absence of a formalized response, mutual distrust again, different strategic culture, personalized decision-making, and the lack of domestic consensus on the importance of the issue or the nature of the response. We had a great snapshot from Scott Edwards, who drew our attention to work to map 41 regional level blue crime responses in terms of both formal and informal institutions. And he used this to illustrate the reasons for the fragmentation and its implications. On the green side, we heard from Stephen Broad, who identified examples of responses at different stages of wildlife tracking, highlighting how deficiencies in some areas were undermining the overall response and how strengthening those point elements of the chain could result in a much more effective end-to-end solution. We talked about criminal sanctions being inconsistent and insufficient, small fines and short jail terms at best, and hampered again by corruption and lack of political will. Blue crime, I think our speakers thought, was especially hard to enforce. But we had some recommendations around how we can strengthen those areas in the undermining field. Obviously, picking up on my previous point, more qualitative research to understand the context for these crimes. Who, why, the social issues behind each crime, why the corruption, the weak governance, the poverty, the market demand drivers, why are they particularly affecting these areas and how can those be addressed? What our speakers tantalizingly hinted at was, by studying those drivers in more detail, we could not only look at how we could undermine current crime, but also we could see where the criminals would be going next, so that we could predict their moves and be waiting for them, rather than always playing this sort of whack-a-mole game of catch-up. So qualitative data, please, and specific data from ports. That was a key point that Hannah Sergi made in her snapshot talk. The land-sea interface for many blue crimes, key data available there. But how do we get it when people are actively hampering us? We also talked about better education for offenders and potential offenders. Sasha Riley-Smith gave us a lovely case study of Namibia, and we ended up feeling almost sorry for the poor poachers who had no idea what they were doing, where the wildlife went, and indeed who was involved, and are all now regretting their involvement. If we can get to them earlier and cause that regret before they've done the crime, obviously so much the better for all concerned. We looked at we wanted to seek examples of better interagency collaboration, having talked about how the absence of it was hampering efforts. And Malcolm Brown gave us a great example of the Joint Maritime Security Centre, really strong example of an interagency mechanism, developing trust and turning the centre into a real centre of excellence for interagency cooperation. I should note, we had a little bit of debate around the relative merits of informal and formal structures. Some on our group loved informal structures and said they were much more effective. The voices of caution noticed that, of course, this does provide a bit of an opportunity for personalized decision-making, corruption, and some of the other things which were, of course, drivers of crime. So bit of a tension there, but either way, more interagency cooperation, and look at the Joint Maritime Centre. We looked at novel sanctions, obviously here driven by Josh's thinking. Litigation, making perpetrators liable for the damage their crimes causing, matching their penalties to the costs of the crime and the consequences of the crime. Not a small fine and a slap on the wrist, but having to pay for the costs of the cleanup in the case of pollution or environmental crime. And we noticed that happily, this allowed for the opportunity for some cavalry to emerge over the hill to help out hard-pressed law enforcement, because of course here, private institutions, NGOs, the third sector can step in and take the burden of the litigation, allowing law enforcement to concentrate on what it does best. Last but not least, we of course wanted more capacity. Who doesn't want more capacity? And what did we want? Well, we wanted training, we wanted material, we always do. But we did notice, with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, that unfortunately when people ask for kit, it's usually the kit they want rather than the kit that's most useful. And often it just becomes interagency status symbols rather than actually useful. So here again, we looked back to Matt's examples in Indonesia and the role that the community can play in advising on what really is working and what isn't working, and therefore where the investment in capacity really needs to be placed. We noticed that, of course, community engagement is hard. Having conversations with victims and potential perpetrators between them and people in power structures is not easy. A shared understanding, a shared language is very difficult. But again, looking at Matt's work in Indonesia, innovative communication methods, collages, drawings, ways in which people could arrive at a shared baseline of the problem and therefore a shared understanding of what would work. And definitely allowing us all to understand whether we're working to the same theory of change. You know, is what we're trying to achieve what they want us to achieve? Will it all collectively work as a whole? I think we had a bit of a spat in the chat about whether or not we want to go into the definition piece. Those of us who are former civil servants can rarely resist the opportunity to come up with a really perfect definition, either of a thing or a problem. But I have to note, in the interest of completeness, that there was a sense that specifically with green and blue crimes, there is a lot of what they are and what is driving them and who's doing them that does fall outside traditional definitions of serious and organized crime, and that we might therefore want to look at some of our assumptions about how you tackle serious and organized crime and ask whether they are equally appropriate to those perpetrating blue and green crimes. There are, of course, also overlaps with other crime types, not just serious and organized crime. David Roberts was very interesting on the overlaps between wildlife crime and cybercrime. And I think we generally felt that if there could be a little bit of academic study around how you might broaden approaches to serious and organized crime to make sure that you're not missing blue and green crime, the world of blue and green crime enforcement law enforcement might be helped. So that's it from me and my group for the moment, and looking forward to the questions and the other panelists.